I still remember the exact moment my son decided I no longer belonged in my own life. "Mom, I've already found a place for you," Brandon said, not looking at me as he cut into his steak. "It's a really nice nursing home. You'll be more comfortable there." The words landed softly, almost politely, but there was something final in his tone, something that didn't invite discussion, only compliance. I didn't respond right away. I picked up my napkin, folded it carefully on my lap, and studied his face the way I used to when he was a boy trying to hide a lie. At 45, he still had that same tell. He avoided eye contact when he knew he was doing something he couldn't fully justify. "A nursing home?" I repeated, my voice calm, almost curious, as if we were discussing vacation plans instead of my future. He nodded, relieved I wasn't making a scene. "Yeah, they've got great staff, activities, medical support. It's really the best option at your age." At your age. I let that settle in the air between us. The same son I had raised, fed, protected, and quietly supported through every bad decision now spoke to me like I was a problem to be managed. I glanced at his wife, who sat silently beside him, her eyes fixed on her plate, as if this conversation had already been rehearsed somewhere I wasn't invited. "Which one?" I asked, reaching for my glass of water. He looked up, slightly surprised. "What do you mean? Which nursing home did you choose?" I asked again, taking a small sip. My hand was steady. It always was. He leaned back in his chair, confidence returning now that he thought I was cooperating. "It's called Silver Pines. Top-rated. I already spoke with the manager. They have an opening next week." Silver Pines. I repeated the name in my mind, slowly, deliberately, like tasting something familiar after years of not having it. I nodded once, as if impressed. "That sounds thoughtful," I said. He smiled then, the kind of smile people wear when they believe they've handled something difficult well. "I just want what's best for you, Mom," he added, and for a moment, anyone watching might have believed him. But I had spent 70 years learning the difference between concern and convenience. And this wasn't concern. This was a decision. Made without me, for reasons that had nothing to do with my comfort. I set my glass down and looked at him fully now, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift in his seat. "You've already arranged everything?" I asked. "Yeah," he said quickly. "All you have to do is pack a few things. They'll take care of the rest." All I had to do. I almost smiled. Instead, I nodded again, slow and measured. "All right," I said. "If that's where you think I should go, then let's go see it." The relief on his face was immediate. He thought this was over. He thought I had accepted my place. He didn't know that by choosing that particular place, by speaking that name out loud, he had just walked me straight into a room where I held every advantage. And I wasn't about to correct him. Not yet. I went to bed that night at the same time I always did, 10 o'clock sharp, but nothing about the house felt the same. The hallway lights cast long shadows across the hardwood floors, and for the first time in years, the silence felt observed, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I moved through each room slowly, not out of sadness but out of habit, the kind built over decades. The living room still smelled faintly of lavender polish. The kitchen counters were spotless, just the way I liked them. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything except the way my son had spoken to me. I paused by the window overlooking the backyard, my hand resting lightly on the frame. I remembered Brandon at 5 years old, running across that grass with scraped knees and a crooked grin, calling out for me like I was the center of his world. Back then, he needed me for everything. Now, apparently, he had decided I needed to be managed. I did not feel anger. That would have been too simple. What I felt was clarity. The kind that comes when something you have been quietly suspecting finally reveals itself in full daylight. This had not started tonight. No, this had been building for months. The questions about my finances. The subtle suggestions about downsizing. The way he had started finishing my sentences, as if I were already fading. I walked into my study and turned on the small desk lamp, its warm light pooling over a stack of neatly organized documents. I opened the top drawer and took out a thin folder, one I had not needed to touch in quite some time. Inside were copies of agreements, ownership structures, and signatures that most people in my family did not even know existed. I ran my fingers over the pages, not reading them, just acknowledging them. After my husband passed, I made a decision. I stepped back. I let others believe that I had simplified my life, that I had handed over responsibilities, that I was just another widow settling into quiet retirement. It made things easier. People revealed themselves when they thought you were no longer in control. And Brandon had revealed more than he realized. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer with the same care I use for everything else in my life. No rush. No panic. Just precision. Then I reached for my phone and scrolled to a number I had not called in a while. Daniel Brooks. I let it ring twice before he answered. "Mrs. Carter," he said immediately, his voice steady, respectful. He always remembered. "Good evening, Daniel," I replied. "I believe I will be visiting Silver Pines tomorrow." There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion but recognition. He understood what that meant without me needing to explain. "Of course," he said. "I will make sure everything is prepared." I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, though no one was there to see it. "No," I said gently. "Do not prepare anything differently. I would like things exactly as they are." Another pause. Then, "Understood." I ended the call and set the phone down. For a moment I simply stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the house, feeling the weight of the next day settle into place. Brandon thought he was taking me somewhere I did not belong. He thought he had already made the important decisions. But what he did not understand was this. I had spent a lifetime building systems that looked ordinary from the outside. Places that people underestimated. Places where real authority was not announced but recognized. And tomorrow he was going to walk me straight into one of them, believing he was in control. That was his first mistake. And I had no intention of correcting it. Brandon arrived the next morning 10 minutes earlier than he said he would, which was unusual for him, but not surprising given how eager he seemed to complete what he had started the night before. He knocked once lightly, as if this were a routine visit and not the beginning of something far more significant. I opened the door before he could knock again, already dressed, already prepared, my coat buttoned, my handbag resting neatly over my arm. He blinked when he saw me, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his face. "You are ready?" he asked, glancing past me into the house as if expecting to see half-packed boxes or some sign of hesitation. I nodded, stepping outside and closing the door behind me with a soft, deliberate click. "I have always been ready when decisions are made," I said, my voice even, not challenging, not submissive, just factual. He gave a small laugh, the kind people use to fill silence they do not quite understand. "Well, that makes this easier," he said, reaching for my bag, but I kept it in my hand, not pulling away sharply, just not offering it, and after a second he withdrew his hand, pretending it had not happened. The drive to Silver Pines took about 25 minutes, long enough for him to explain again how good the facility was, how many positive reviews it had, how the staff was really attentive. He spoke in that same measured tone, as if repeating points he had rehearsed, occasionally glancing at me to see if I would react, but I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching the familiar streets pass by, the grocery store on Maple Avenue, the small park where Brandon used to insist on feeding ducks even when we had no bread, the quiet intersections where life had once felt simple and contained. He filled the car with explanations, but none of them were for me, they were for himself, reassurance disguised as conversation. "You will like it there," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost hopeful. I turned slightly toward him, just enough for him to feel my attention. "I am sure it will be very well managed," I replied, letting the last words settle just long enough to make him glance at me again, but he did not question it. He simply nodded, relieved once more that I was not resisting. When we pulled into the entrance, the sign for Silver Pines stood exactly as I remembered it, understated, polished, the landscaping trimmed to quiet perfection. Nothing about it screamed luxury, and that was intentional. Real power rarely needed to announce itself. Brandon parked near the front entrance and stepped out quickly, walking around the car to open my door, a gesture that might have looked considerate to anyone watching, but I recognized it for what it was, a final performance of care. "Here we are," he said, offering his hand. This time I accepted it, not because I needed help, but because I wanted him to believe I did. The glass doors opened automatically as we approached, and the familiar scent of clean linen and subtle citrus filled the air. The lobby was exactly as it should be, calm, quiet, efficient, a place designed to put people at ease while everything important happened just beneath the surface. Brandon stepped forward, his posture straightening as if he were entering a place where he expected to be in control. "Hi, we are here for an intake," he began, addressing the front desk with polite authority, but before the receptionist could respond, I saw a figure moving from the hallway beyond, steady, composed, unmistakable. Daniel Brooks did not rush. He never did. He approached with the same measured pace he used in every decision that mattered. His eyes moved past Brandon, without hesitation, and settled on me. And in that single moment, before a word was spoken, the balance in the room had already begun to shift. Daniel stopped a few feet in front of us, his posture straight, his expression composed, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes that only someone who knew him well would recognize. Acknowledgement, not surprise, not confusion, just quiet confirmation. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice measured, respectful, carrying just enough weight to settle the room. Brandon's hand, still loosely hovering near my elbow, froze for a fraction of a second before dropping to his side. He turned slightly, glancing between us as if trying to understand why the manager of this facility was addressing me first, and not him. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied, my tone calm, familiar, as though we had simply crossed paths in a place that belonged equally to both of us, which in a way we had. "I hope everything is running smoothly today," I added, and it was not a casual question. Daniel understood that. He inclined his head slightly. "As always," he said, "we maintain the standards you set." The words were simple, but they landed with precision. Brandon shifted beside me, his brow tightening just enough to reveal the first crack in his confidence. "Actually," he interjected quickly, stepping forward, reclaiming what he believed was his role, "I called yesterday about an intake. This is my mother. We are here to get her settled in." Daniel turned his head toward him then, slowly, not dismissive but not deferential either, the kind of look one gives when assessing information that may or may not be relevant. "Of course," Daniel said politely, though his attention returned to me almost immediately. "We were expecting you," he continued, and this time there was no ambiguity in who he meant. Brandon blinked, clearly thrown off now. "Expecting her?" he repeated, his voice losing some of its earlier certainty. I did not look at him. I kept my gaze on Daniel, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. "Yes," Daniel said evenly. "Mrs. Carter informed us she would be visiting today." There was a pause, then a brief, quiet space where the air seemed to settle differently. Brandon let out a small, uncertain laugh, the kind people use when something does not make sense but they are not ready to admit it. "Right? Well, that works out," he said, attempting to regain control. "So we can just go ahead and start the paperwork, get her room assigned." Daniel did not move, did not reach for any forms, did not gesture toward the reception desk. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side and extended his hand, not toward the intake area, but toward the hallway leading deeper into the building. "If you would follow me," he said, addressing me directly. "We have prepared a more appropriate space for this conversation." Brandon frowned, his confusion now more visible. "A conversation?" he asked. "We just need the intake forms." Daniel's expression remained unchanged. "That will not be necessary at this time," he replied calmly. I took a step forward, my shoes making a soft, steady sound against the polished floor, and Daniel fell into step beside me without hesitation, as he always had when decisions mattered. I could feel Brandon lingering behind for a second before hurrying to catch up, his footsteps slightly uneven now, his earlier confidence replaced by something else, something closer to uncertainty. As we walked past the reception area, past the quiet seating spaces and the carefully arranged decor, I noticed the staff, subtle glances, small nods, the kind of recognition that did not need to be announced. Brandon noticed it too. I could tell by the way he straightened his shoulders, trying to reassert himself in a space that no longer responded to him the way he expected. We reached a set of double doors marked administrative, and Daniel opened them without hesitation, holding them for me first. I stepped through, not as a guest, not as a patient, but as someone returning to a place that had never truly been out of reach, and behind me I heard Brandon hesitate, just for a moment before following, stepping into a room where he no longer understood the rules. The room Daniel led us into was not what Brandon expected. It was not small, not clinical, and certainly not a place where intake forms were filled out. It was a boardroom, quiet, polished, with a long table at its center and large windows that let in steady morning light. The kind of room where decisions were made, not where people were placed. I walked in without hesitation and took a seat at the head of the table, the chair familiar in a way that settled into my posture without effort. Daniel remained standing for a moment, then moved to my right, his position deliberate, respectful, while Brandon stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had expected. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tighter now, less certain. I folded my hands lightly on the table and looked at him, not unkindly, but without the softness he was used to. "A more appropriate place to talk," I said, echoing Daniel's earlier words. He stepped further into the room, slower this time, his confidence no longer leading his movements. "I thought we were just getting her checked in," he said, looking at Daniel as if waiting for him to correct the situation, to bring things back to something familiar. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a chair along the side of the table, not at the head, not beside me, but at a distance that made the hierarchy in the room unmistakably clear. "Please have a seat," he said, his tone professional, neutral. Brandon hesitated, then sat, his posture stiff, his hands resting awkwardly on the table as if unsure where they belonged. I let the silence stretch for a moment, long enough for him to feel the shift completely, then I spoke. "You said you had already arranged everything." I began, my voice even, "that all I needed to do was pack a few things and let them take care of the rest." He nodded quickly, grasping at the familiarity of his own words. "Yes, exactly, that is what this place does," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. I tilted my head slightly, considering him. "And you chose this place carefully?" I asked. "Of course," he replied, a trace of defensiveness creeping in. "It is one of the best in the state. I did my research." I allowed myself a small pause, just enough to let his answer settle before I continued. "That is good," I said quietly. "It means you recognized quality when you saw it." Daniel's gaze remained forward, but I could sense his awareness sharpen slightly. Brandon exhaled, as if relieved to finally hear something that sounded like approval. "Exactly," he said, leaning back a little, trying to reclaim his earlier confidence. "I would not send you somewhere I did not trust." I held his gaze then, steady, unhurried. "No," I said, "you would not." Another pause, this one longer, more deliberate, the kind that draws attention to itself without raising a voice. "What you did not realize," I continued, my tone unchanged, "is that this place was never chosen by you." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that shifted something in his expression. Immediately, his brow furrowed, confusion replacing certainty. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice lower now. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not in retreat but in quiet ownership of the space. "I mean," I said, "that long before you ever walked through those doors, long before you decided what was best for me, I was the one who built what you are sitting in." Daniel finally spoke then, his voice calm, confirming what had just been set in motion. "Mrs. Carter is the principal owner of this facility," he said, "and of the entire Silver Pines network." The room went very still. Brandon stared at me, the color draining slightly from his face, his mind working to catch up to something he had never considered possible, and for the first time since the conversation began, he had nothing to say. Brandon did not speak right away. He just stared at me as if the words he had just heard needed to be rearranged into something that made sense, something smaller, something less threatening to everything he believed about the situation. "That does not make sense," he said finally, his voice uneven. "You never told me anything about owning something like this." I held his gaze without blinking, without softening. "No," I replied, "I did not." The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the weight of everything he had assumed about me, about control, about who held power in this family. He leaned forward slightly, his hands pressing against the table as if grounding himself. "So what, you are saying you own this building?" he asked, trying to narrow the scope to make it manageable. I shook my head once, slowly. "Not just this building," I said, my voice steady. "This is one of 12 facilities under the same structure, all operating under the same standards, the same leadership." Daniel remained still beside me, but I could sense the confirmation in his posture, the quiet reinforcement of every word I spoke. Brandon let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. 12? He repeated. His tone caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation. I nodded. 12, I said. And every one of them was built with the same intention, to create a system where people are treated with dignity, not managed like inconveniences. I let that last word rest between us, not raised, not emphasized, just placed where it could not be ignored. His jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of defensiveness rising to the surface. "I was not managing you," he said quickly. "I was trying to help. You are 70, Mom. You cannot keep doing everything on your own forever." I watched him carefully, the way his voice shifted, the way he leaned on concern as a shield. "Help?" I repeated quietly. Is that what you call deciding where I live without asking me? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for something that sounded reasonable, something that would restore his position, but the room was no longer arranged in his favor. I just thought it was time, he said finally, softer now, less certain. I leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to bring my words closer to him. You thought it was time, I said, because it was convenient for you. Daniel moved then, placing a thin folder on the table, sliding it gently toward me. I rested my hand on it but did not open it yet. Brandon's eyes followed the motion, suspicion replacing confusion. What is that? He asked. I glanced down briefly, then back at him. This, I said, is a record of the conversations you have had over the past 3 weeks regarding this facility. His expression shifted again, sharper this time. What conversations? He asked, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel answered before I could. You spoke with our admissions coordinator twice, he said calmly, and with our financial office once. You asked about long-term placement, asset considerations, and transfer timelines. Brandon's face tightened. That is standard, he said quickly. I was just making sure everything was in order. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the surface of his explanation. Yes, I said, you were making sure everything was in order. I let the repetition hang there, then added, for yourself. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different, not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that comes when a truth is no longer avoidable. And as I sat there, looking at my son across that table, I realized something with complete clarity. This was not about where I would live, it never had been, it was about who he believed had the right to decide. Brandon sat there for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the folder in front of me, but not really seeing it. I could tell his mind was racing, trying to reframe everything, trying to find a version of reality where he was still in control, where this was just a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right words. You are twisting this, he said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled but thinner than before. I was just trying to make sure you were taken care of. That is what a son is supposed to do. I studied him quietly, the way I had done all my life, watching not just what he said, but how he said it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the careful choice of words, the way he leaned on obligation now instead of confidence. A son, I repeated, is supposed to ask, not arrange. He opened his mouth again, faster this time. I did not think it was a big deal. It is just a place, people do this all the time. You are acting like He stopped himself, cutting off the sentence before it finished, but the damage was already done. I leaned back slightly, giving him space to hear what he had just revealed. Like you what? I asked calmly. He shook his head, looking away for a second, then back at me, trying again. I just thought it would be easier, he said, for everyone. There it was, the word that mattered, not me, not my needs, not my life, everyone. I nodded once, slowly acknowledging it. Easier, I said. For you? Daniel remained still, but I could sense the quiet agreement in his presence. Brandon shifted in his chair, frustration starting to replace his earlier uncertainty. Why are you making this into something it is not? He asked, his voice rising just enough to betray the pressure building underneath. You have a big house, you live alone, you could fall, you could get sick. I was trying to prevent a problem before it happened. I let him finish, let him build his argument fully, because it was important that he heard himself. Then I spoke. And in preventing that problem, I said, you decided I no longer had the right to choose where I live. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That is not what I said. I did not raise my voice, I did not interrupt, I simply held the truth steady in front of him. It is exactly what you did, I said. The room seemed quieter now, the kind of quiet that makes every word feel more precise, more permanent. Daniel reached for the folder then and opened it, turning it toward Brandon, not aggressively, just clearly. These are your requests, he said, his tone professional. You asked about asset transfers, about how quickly residency could be finalized, about whether family members could manage financial accounts during transition. Brandon's eyes moved across the pages, faster at first, then slower as the implications settled in. That is standard, he said again, but there was no conviction left in it now. I watched him carefully, then said, you were not asking how I would be cared for. I paused, letting the distinction form. You were asking how I would be moved. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression. Not just confusion, not just defensiveness, but awareness, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been revealed. And in that moment, the distance between us became clear, not measured in years, not measured in choices, but in understanding. He had seen me as someone to be handled, and I had seen him as someone I trusted, and only one of those had been true. Brandon did not look at me this time. He kept his eyes on the folder, flipping one page, then another, as if somewhere between the lines he might find a version of himself that still made sense. But the more he read, the quieter he became, the sharper the room felt around him. "I did not mean it like that," he said finally, his voice lower now, not defensive, not confident, just strained. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence settle, because some words needed space to be understood. For what they truly were, not for what they pretended to be. "You did not have to mean it," I said at last, my tone steady. "You only had to do it." He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, one hand pressing lightly against his forehead as if trying to push the situation away. "I was just trying to make things easier," he repeated, but this time the sentence sounded different, less like an argument, more like something he was telling himself. I watched him for a moment, then said, "Easier. For you is not the same as better for me." Daniel remained silent, but his presence grounded the room, keeping everything clear, structured, undeniable. Brandon lowered his hand and looked at me again. And there was something new in his expression now, not control, not certainty, but something closer to realization. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his voice quieter. "About all of this." He gestured vaguely around the room, the building, the system he had unknowingly stepped into. I held his gaze, unhurried. "Because I wanted to see who you would be when you thought I had nothing left to offer," I said, the words simple but final. He blinked, absorbing that, and for a moment, he did not try to argue, he did not try to explain, he just sat there, and in that stillness something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to be noticed. "So this was a test?" he asked. I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "This was a choice, yours." The distinction mattered, and I could see it land. He looked down again, his hands now resting flat on the table, no longer gripping, no longer trying to hold on to something slipping away. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, almost to himself. I nodded once, acknowledging the possibility without agreeing to it. That is often what people say when they do not want to look too closely at their reasons. I replied. The room grew quiet again, but this time it was not heavy, it was clear, like a window finally opened. Daniel stepped forward slightly then, not interrupting, just reinforcing the structure of the moment. "Mrs. Carter," he said respectfully, "would you like me to proceed with the next steps?" I considered that for a moment, then looked back at Brandon, really looked at him, not as the boy he had been, not as the son I had raised, but as the man sitting in front of me now, the one who had made his decision and revealed himself through it. "Yes," I said finally, my voice calm. "There are a few things that need to be updated." Brandon's head lifted slightly, a flicker of concern returning. "Updated?" he asked. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I turned my attention back to Daniel. "Please make sure that all authorization records reflect the correct structure moving forward," I said. Daniel nodded immediately. "Of course," he replied. And though the words were formal, the meaning behind them was not lost on anyone in the room. Brandon's expression shifted again, tension returning. But this time it was different. It was not about control, it was about consequence. And for the first time since he had walked into that building, he understood that whatever happened next was no longer something he could decide. Daniel did not hesitate. He gathered the folder and stepped toward the side cabinet, retrieving a second set of documents, placing them neatly in front of me. His movements efficient, practiced, the kind that came from years of understanding exactly when something needed to be done and how to do it without drawing unnecessary attention. Brandon watched every motion now, his eyes tracking each paper, each gesture, as if trying to predict what would come next. But the rhythm of the room no longer followed him. It never had. I picked up the pen Daniel offered and turned to the first page, scanning it briefly, not because I needed to, but because I always did things properly, even when the outcome was already decided. "What are you doing?" Brandon asked, his voice tighter again, the edge of urgency returning. I did not look up right away. I signed the first line, then the second, my hand steady, deliberate, before placing the pen down for a moment. "I am making sure that everything reflects reality," I said, finally meeting his eyes. He leaned forward, tension visible now, no longer hidden behind explanations. "What does that mean?" he asked. I held his gaze, calm, unhurried. "It means," I said, "that from this point forward no one makes decisions about my life without my consent." The words were not loud, but they settled with finality. Daniel stepped closer, sliding another page toward me, and I signed again, each signature quiet, precise, but unmistakable in its effect. Brandon shook his head slightly, disbelief mixing with something sharper. "You are overreacting," he said, but the conviction was gone, replaced by something that sounded more like hope than certainty. I paused, pen resting lightly in my hand. No, I said. I am responding. The difference mattered, and I could see it register. Even if he did not want it to, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair, the gesture restless now unsteady. So what, you are just going to shut me out? He asked. I set the pen down fully this time and folded my hands, the same way I had at the beginning, the same quiet posture that had never needed to raise its voice to be heard. No, I said. I am placing you where you chose to stand. He looked at me, confusion flickering again, but softer now, less resistant. I continued. You decided I was someone who needed to be managed, moved, handled without being asked, I said. So I am making sure that you no longer have the ability to do that. Daniel closed the folder gently, signaling the completion of what needed to be done. Brandon sat back slowly, the weight of the moment settling into him fully now, not as a sudden shock, but as something that could not be undone, something that would follow him beyond this room, beyond this day. I did not think, he began, but the sentence faded before it found its end. I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in recognition. I know, I said, standing from my chair, my movements calm, composed, the same way they had always been. I did not rush, I did not linger. I simply stepped away from the table, Daniel moving in quiet coordination beside me. Brandon remained seated for a moment longer, then stood as well, slower this time, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make every step uncertain. I turned toward the door, my hand resting briefly on its polished surface before opening it. The hallway beyond just as calm, just as orderly as before. Nothing about the building had changed, only the understanding of who held the power within it. I stepped through without looking back, because there was nothing left in that room that needed to be said, and behind me, I could hear Brandon take a step forward, then stop, as if realizing that for the first time in his life, he was not being led, and he did not know which way to go.